had never been one for cabin trips. A weekend in the woods, far away from civilization, never sounded like my idea of fun. But when my friend James convinced me to join him on this trip to a remote cabin, I reluctantly agreed. It was supposed to be a chance to unplug and disconnect from the pressures of work. It was supposed to be relaxing. The cabin was located deep in the woods, tucked away in a mountainous area near Lake Timberridge. The closest town was a good hour away, so it wasn't the kind of place you'd go to on a whim. It was isolated, quiet, and, from what James told me, pretty much the last place anyone would ever think to look for you if you just wanted to be left alone. We arrived late on a Friday evening, the sky already dark by the time we pulled off the gravel road and into the cabin's small clearing. The cabin itself was a simple wooden structure, nothing too fancy. 2 floors, a porch, a few windows, and a slanted roof. It looked like something you'd see in an old movie about pioneers or settlers, and I figured that was part of its charm. James was enthusiastic as always. He quickly unloaded the truck while I hung back, pulling my jacket tighter against the chill of the early autumn air. The trees around us were massive, towering over the cabin like silent sentinels. I'd never felt more aware of how alone we were, but I pushed that thought aside. After all, I'd agreed to come here for the weekend, so I might as well make the best of it. Inside, the cabin was cozy. A large stone fireplace dominated the far wall, and a few mismatched chairs were scattered around a wooden coffee table. There was an old record player in the corner and a well-stocked bookshelf. The faint smell of wood, musk, and earth filled the air, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax. It wasn't so bad, I told myself. It wasn't so bad. James set to work unpacking the rest of our supplies. Mostly canned food, some beers, and a few bags of snacks. I wasn't much for drinking, so I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and sat by the fire. The warmth of it against my skin felt like a blessing in the cool night air. James, on the other hand, was eager to get the fire roaring, and within a few minutes, the cabin felt like a furnace. I was about to suggest we open a window when I heard it. A thump, soft at first, like something falling over in the woods outside. I glanced toward the window, but all I could see were shadows stretching beneath the trees, nothing moving. I brushed it off as the wind or an animal. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something out in the woods, and it wouldn't be the last. James didn't seem to notice, his attention fixed on starting a fire in the wood stove. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The thump came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, as if something was dragging itself across the dirt just beyond the cabin. I stood up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. "You hear that?" I asked James. He looked up, his brow furrowing. "What?" "That noise. Outside." James gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "It's probably just an animal. Relax, man." I wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the noise. It wasn't like the usual sounds of the forest. No, this was different. This felt deliberate, as if whatever was making the noise was moving with purpose. The scraping sound continued, and this time it seemed to be getting closer. "Okay, that's weird," I muttered, my unease growing. "I'm going to check it out." I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The cool air bit at my skin, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade as I walked toward the edge of the clearing. My shoes crunched against the leaves, and I scanned the dark woods with the beam of the flashlight, trying to pick out anything that might explain the strange noise. There was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. My heart rate picked up, and for a moment I felt foolish. I was out here in the dark, looking for, what? A raccoon? A deer? I was just about to turn back when I saw it. A faint, low glow through the trees. It wasn't the moonlight, which was nearly hidden behind the clouds. It wasn't a reflection from the cabin. It was something else, something unnatural. I swallowed hard, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But I didn't. Instead, I moved closer, drawn toward the glow. The light was dim, barely visible, and it flickered in strange, uneven intervals. It was coming from further into the woods, beyond the tree line, just out of sight. As I walked, the scraping sound grew louder, more distinct. My mind raced, imagining all sorts of ridiculous explanations. A campfire? Some other hikers? But the further I went, the less certain I became that there was anyone else out here. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. The trees felt closer now, pressing in around me, blocking out any sense of the world beyond. My footsteps grew louder as the silence of the woods enveloped me. The scraping sound had stopped, but now I could hear something else. A low, rhythmic thudding, like something heavy being dropped to the ground, repeatedly. I was about to call out, to shout for James, but then I saw it. Just ahead, a figure in the darkness. It was tall, shrouded in shadow, but I could see the outlines of its limbs moving slowly, deliberately, dragging something behind it. The glow I had seen earlier seemed to emanate from the figure itself, casting strange shadows on the ground. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't another person. It was something else. Something I couldn't even begin to explain. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the cabin, my lungs burning, my legs weak from the sprint. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. James was still by the fire, oblivious to the panic that gripped me. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, looking up from his book. "Get your stuff." I panted, my voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now." James frowned, clearly confused. "What are you talking about? Relax, man. It's just the woods." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "There's something out there. Something not right. I saw it." James raised an eyebrow, clearly not taking me seriously. But there was no way I could stay in this cabin another minute. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and stepped out into the cold night air. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly before me, an impenetrable mass of shadows and trees. And then, just as I was about to reach the truck, I heard the sound again, the scraping, followed by the thudding. This time it was closer, a lot closer. "James!" I yelled, turning around to find him standing in the doorway, staring at me. I didn't wait for him to make up his mind. I got in the truck, started the engine, and peeled out of the clearing. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and every turn felt like it could be my last. The sounds from the woods echoed in my ears as I drove, but I didn't dare look back. By the time we reached the town, the sun was starting to rise, but I didn't feel safe. I felt sick. What I had seen out there, what had followed me back to the cabin, I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing for sure. I'd never go back to that cabin. Not ever. James didn't get it. He still laughed it off, said it was probably just some strange animal. But I knew the truth. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't natural, and I wasn't about to let it get any closer. We never talked about the trip again, and as the years passed, I tried my best to forget it. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the trees creak, I still hear the sound of scraping, the thudding that follows it. And I know deep down that whatever it was, it's still out there. It was the middle of autumn when I decided to get away from the noise of the city. I was 27, feeling the weight of a few too many late nights at work, too many stressful deadlines, and too many evenings spent surrounded by people I barely knew. I needed quiet. I needed solitude. So, when I stumbled upon an ad online for a small cabin in the woods, tucked away near a lake about 2 hours from where I lived, I booked it. No second thoughts, no hesitation. The cabin was an old one, built somewhere in the late 70s, according to the owner. He seemed like the type who didn't really care much for modern amenities or technology, and I was okay with that. I wanted the disconnection, the peace, and the raw simplicity of nature. I wanted to be cut off. I packed only the basics: clothes, food, some books, and a few things to make the cabin more comfortable. The car ride out there was pleasant enough, though the roads grew more uneven as I drove farther from the nearest town. The deeper I got into the woods, the more I felt the weight of isolation settle over me. When I finally arrived, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined, but it had character. The wooden beams were worn and weathered by time, but the place felt solid. There were no neighbors, no signs of civilization, just trees, dirt roads, and the constant murmur of the nearby lake. The only thing that could be heard was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I unloaded my car, carried my bags inside, and immediately began setting up. The cabin had an old stove, a few mismatched chairs, a small fireplace, and a single bedroom with a bed that creaked whenever you moved. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books, some of which I planned to read. I could already feel the stress of the city beginning to fade. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner over the stove, set up a fire, and settled in with a book. I didn't feel scared, not even a little. The solitude was peaceful. I went to bed early, wrapped up in the warmth of the blankets, listening to the sounds of the woods outside. But then, on the second night, things started to change. It was about midnight when I was awoken by a noise. I wasn't sure what it was at first. A creak? A knock? My mind raced through the possibilities. Branches brushing against the cabin, the wind howling, or maybe just the house settling. I tried to ignore it, turning over and pulling the blanket tighter around me. But the noise came again, louder this time. A thud, a scraping sound. My heart rate quickened, and I couldn't dismiss it. Something wasn't right. I got out of bed, careful not to make too much noise. The cabin was dark, with only the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. I grabbed a flashlight and moved to the window. Outside, it was pitch black, except for the occasional flicker of moonlight through the trees. I couldn't see anything moving, nothing that would explain the sound. But the air felt different, heavier, colder, almost oppressive. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. The woods were strange, after all, and the isolation played tricks on your mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the next hour checking the locks on all the windows and doors, double-checking that everything was in place. It was fine, I told myself. It had to be. After all, I was alone in a cabin, miles away from anyone. There was no reason to be afraid. But I couldn't get back to sleep. Every noise outside, every rustle of leaves, made my muscles tense. I lay there, listening to the stillness of the night, hoping for it to pass. The following morning, I woke up exhausted, but I decided to ignore the unease I felt. I made some coffee and spent the day outside, walking by the lake, breathing in the fresh air, and trying to clear my head. The weather was chilly, but the sun was out, and the autumn colors were in full swing. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the silence. Even though there were birds, insects, and the occasional animal moving through the trees, it felt as if the forest was holding its breath. It was too quiet. No distant hum of traffic, no sounds of people. Just me and the endless stretch of trees. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard the noise again. This time it was closer, coming from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. This was something more deliberate, something human. I froze, my hand stilling over the stove. My heart skipped a beat. I set the spatula down slowly, then crept to the back window, the one that faced the forest. Nothing. No one. I checked the back door, locked. All the windows were shut, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Someone watching me. By the third night, the sense of unease had grown to a palpable fear. I hadn't heard anything during the day, but every time the wind picked up, I felt like I was being surrounded. I locked every door and window again, but this time, I didn't feel safe. Every creak of the wood, every distant thud made my skin crawl. I made the decision to leave. It wasn't worth staying in a place that made me feel like this. But as I began packing my things, I noticed something strange. My car keys were missing. I searched the cabin from top to bottom, going through every drawer, every shelf, even checking the fireplace, but the keys were gone. There was no way I could have misplaced them. I hadn't even taken them out of my pocket since I arrived. At this point, panic started setting in. I checked my phone, but there was no service, no bars, no connection to the outside world. That's when I heard it again, this time unmistakable. A heavy knock at the front door. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone was definitely out there. I didn't know what to do. There was no way I was opening the door, not with whatever or whoever was on the other side. I grabbed the axe from the corner by the fireplace, the only tool that could offer any kind of protection, and waited. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. The knock didn't come again. The air was still, but the unease didn't leave. I stayed awake, listening for any more sounds, for anything that would give me a clue about what was going on. But it was quiet again, as if the world had gone still. The next morning, I found my car keys on the front step. No sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt. It was as if the night had never happened. But I couldn't leave fast enough. I packed up everything and got in my car, started the engine, and drove off. As I passed the long stretch of road leading out of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone had been watching me the entire time, and that whatever it was still out there, waiting. I don't know what happened out there, but I do know one thing: I've never gone back, and I don't plan to. There are places in this world that you just don't go. There are things in the woods that you don't want to find, and some things are better left undiscovered. It's 8 p.m. The sky outside has just begun to turn a deep shade of navy, and I can feel the cold settling into the cabin as I take in the peaceful isolation of the woods around me. It's a quiet place, nestled in the mountains, far from any towns or bustling streets. No one else for miles. Just me and the towering pines that seem to stretch endlessly into the sky. I came up here for some peace and solitude, to disconnect for a while, and that's exactly what I got. The small cabin was built years ago by an old man. Judging by the worn-out edges of the floorboards and the rusted nails that barely hold the rafters in place. It's not much, just a single room with a tiny wood stove, a bed in the corner, and a simple kitchen setup. But it's cozy in its own way, and I like the stillness. There's something comforting about the quiet, a serenity that feels hard to come by in the modern world. As I sit at the table, sipping on my coffee, I think back to how I ended up here. After a long few months of work and stress, I needed a break, a chance to breathe. I figured a few days in the cabin would be just what I needed to reset. I came up alone, wanting to clear my head and get away from everything. I grabbed my coat and headed outside to take a walk. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a thin blanket of snow that crunched under my boots. The trees stood tall around me, their branches creaking in the wind. The whole scene was picture perfect, like something out of a postcard. But there was something unsettling about it too. The woods were too quiet, almost unnervingly so. No chirping birds, no rustling animals, just the occasional gust of wind and the sound of my boots crunching through the snow. I walked for about an hour just exploring the area around the cabin. I couldn't help but notice the way the trees seemed to close in around me the farther I went. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for me to walk through without brushing up against the thick trunks. It was like the forest was watching, waiting for something. Eventually, I turned back, a slight unease settling in the pit of my stomach. It was nothing, I told myself, just the isolation. That's all it was. As I made my way back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the door. They weren't mine. I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived, and the only way to get to the cabin was down a long, narrow path, far from any roads or trails. My heart rate picked up. I'm sure it's nothing, I told myself again. Maybe it's just an animal, maybe someone had walked up here before me. But the tracks were too big to be from any animal I knew. They were human, clear and distinct, and they led right up to my door. I froze in place, staring at the prints. I didn't know what to think. For a moment, I just stood there, watching the tracks as if they might suddenly vanish. But they didn't. They were still there, etched into the snow, leading right up to my doorstep. I walked inside, locking the door behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. It's fine, I told myself. It's probably just someone passing by. The woods aren't as empty as they seem. But as the night settled in and the wind howled outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence was broken only by the occasional crackling of the wood stove and the shadows of the trees outside swayed in the dim light. I tried to relax, pulling a blanket around my shoulders as I sat by the stove. The heat from the fire was comforting, but the unease lingered. Every so often, I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing just outside, staring in. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, the sound of the wind outside and the creaking of the cabin making me jump. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints in the snow, felt the weight of them pressing down on my chest. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone had been here, and they were still nearby, watching. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck, my eyes bleary from a restless night. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a faint golden glow over the snow outside. The cabin was still and quiet, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire. I decided to check outside again, just to see if the footprints were still there. Maybe I'd imagined it all. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold, the snow crunching underfoot. The tracks were still there, right where I had seen them the night before. But this time, something was different. There were more tracks. They didn't lead up to the cabin this time, though. They went off to the side, weaving through the trees. I could see them clearly, the prints sharp against the snow. They were fresh, as if whoever had made them had just passed by. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, staring at the trail. It was too late to turn back now, so I grabbed my jacket and began to follow the tracks, my breath visible in the cold air. The path wound deeper into the woods, and with each step, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The trees loomed overhead, casting long, dark shadows on the ground. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps and the occasional crack of a twig beneath my boots. I don't know how long I walked. The tracks led me further and further away from the cabin, twisting through the dense forest. My mind raced with questions. Who had made these tracks? Why had they come up here? And why did they seem to be leading me somewhere? Eventually, the trail stopped at a small clearing. In the center of it stood a shack. It was old, the wood weathered and rotting. The door was ajar, and the windows were shattered, the glass long since fallen out. It looked abandoned, like something out of a nightmare. I stood there for a moment staring at the shack. The tracks led right up to it, but no one was around. No movement, no sounds, just the silence of the forest pressing in. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, my pulse quickening. My feet crunched in the snow as I walked closer to the shack. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I immediately regretted it. The air inside was thick, stale, and musty. The smell of rot hit me hard, making me gag. It was dark inside, the light from outside barely filtering through the broken windows. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. There was nothing here, just old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But then, my gaze fell on something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner, there was a pile of clothing, mostly torn and shredded. It looked like someone had been living here. My mind raced, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Someone had been here, and they were still out there. I needed to get back to the cabin. I turned to leave, but before I could, I heard a sound, a rustling coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my throat. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I rushed to the door, my hands trembling as I pulled it open. The moment I stepped outside, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the trees just beyond the clearing. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, my body frozen in place. But something deep inside me told me I needed to leave. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, my feet slipping in the snow as I sprinted through the woods. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, getting closer. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, my body shaking with adrenaline. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed inside, the fire crackling in the stove, and didn't move from the cabin. I didn't hear anything else from outside, but I knew someone had been out there. Someone was watching me. The next day, I left. I couldn't stay another minute. I packed up my things, locked the cabin behind me, and drove away. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. The woods are quiet again, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing someone was out there, waiting. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still feel it. That cold, eerie feeling that I'm not alone, that I never was. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to take some time off from everything. I was 32, living in St. Paul, Minnesota, working in property management, and I'd been getting chewed up by stress for months. Emails, phone calls, complaints, it felt like every hour of my day was claimed by someone else. I needed silence. I needed to hear myself think again. I hadn't slept right in weeks. When I finally burned through the last of my patience and sent a resignation email one Friday night, I packed a few things and got out the next morning. I remembered a small, off-grid cabin that my uncle had owned near Deadfall Ridge in northern Wisconsin. He'd passed away a few years earlier, and no one had touched the place since. I still had the key on an old ring. It wasn't far, maybe a 4-hour drive northeast. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want anyone knowing. I just needed to vanish for a while, away from lights, noise, everything. I loaded up my Subaru with a cooler, camping stove, canned food, extra water, a first aid kit, some books, and a sleeping bag. I took a small Ruger .22 rifle just for peace of mind, mostly for critters, I figured. The cell signal would be non-existent up there, so I downloaded some offline maps and a GPS backup. The plan was simple. Go up, spend a week in total silence, reset my brain, then come back to the world. The road narrowed the further I went. Asphalt turned to gravel, gravel turned to dirt, and eventually even that gave out. The trail was overgrown, but I remembered just enough to keep going. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up beside the cabin. The place looked worse than I remembered. Moss was creeping up the sides, and one of the shutters was hanging half off. Still, the roof looked intact, and the door was still locked. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. There were cobwebs in the corners and mouse droppings near the sink, but nothing too wild. The water pump was bone dry, which I expected, and the fireplace had old ash in it. I cracked a few windows and let the air settle. It took a few hours to clean the place up enough to feel livable, but by the time the sun dipped low, I had a small fire going, a can of chili heating on my little stove, and a cot set up in the corner with my sleeping bag. That first night was quiet, dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I kept expecting to hear a plane or a car or even some distant dogs barking, but there was nothing, just the occasional wind dragging across the roof or the snap of a twig outside. By the third day, I'd settled into a rhythm. Wake up with the sun, boil some instant coffee, sit on the front steps and listen to the forest. Sometimes I read. Other times I'd just walk a trail for hours, following deer paths and old game trails through the woods. I didn't see anyone. No hunters, no hikers, no campers. Not even a hint of another soul. That suited me fine. On the fourth day, something changed. I woke up feeling stiff and cold. It had dipped below freezing overnight, and I hadn't stoked the fireplace before falling asleep. I pulled on a heavier hoodie and went to start a fire, but I noticed the woodpile looked different. Some of the pieces I'd stacked were moved, just slightly off. I thought maybe an animal had tried to dig around. A raccoon or porcupine, maybe. I brushed it off, got the fire going, and went about my morning. Later that afternoon, I went deeper into the woods than usual. I followed a dry creek I hadn't seen before, and it led to an old hunting blind about 2 miles out. It was just a platform nailed between two trees, rotted and leaning. I climbed up out of curiosity and found a rusted coffee can with old cigarette butts inside. I figured it hadn't been used in years. When I got back to the cabin around sunset, I found the front door cracked open. I froze. My heart kicked into overdrive. I was sure I'd locked it. I always did. My hand went straight to the rifle slung over my back. I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the clearing, listening. Nothing moved. The trees swayed a little in the wind, but there was no sound from the cabin. After a few minutes, I crept up, stepped to the side of the door, and nudged it open with the barrel of the rifle. Inside looked normal at first, nothing obviously missing or trashed. But as I walked in slowly, I saw that the cooler had been opened. 2 cans were gone, one of chili and one of peaches. The bag with my matches was half dumped out. My sleeping bag had fresh dirt on it. I didn't know what to do. I checked around the cabin, but there was no one inside. I looked for tracks around the property, but the ground was hard and covered in dry leaves. Nothing clear. There was no forced entry, just an unlocked door. That night, I barely slept. I kept the rifle beside me, and every sound outside made me sit up and listen. At some point near 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Slow, steady crunching in the leaves. I didn't move. I barely breathed. They passed the front porch, circled to the back, then faded. The next morning, I considered leaving, but I told myself maybe it was a drifter or an animal. Someone might have just stumbled onto the place, looking for food or shelter. That happens, right? Still, I packed everything up tight and carried the rifle with me all day, even inside. On day 5, I didn't go far from the cabin. I chopped more wood, boiled extra water, and stayed alert. Around noon, I found a cigarette but near the edge of the clearing. Still fresh, not even wet from the dew. I don't smoke. It hadn't been there before. That's when I knew someone was around. I made the choice to sleep during the day and stay up at night. That night, I sat in the dark with the fire out, wrapped in blankets, rifle in hand, and waited. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw movement near the tree-line. Just a shape at first, then 2 people. They were crouched low, maybe 20 yards out, half hidden behind brush. They were watching the cabin. I felt paralyzed. I didn't know what they wanted, if they were armed, if they were just some crazy off-grid types, or worse. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I sat there in total darkness for hours, heart hammering, just watching back. At some point, they vanished. I didn't hear them go, just blinked and they were gone. The next morning, I walked to where they'd been. I found prints, deep ones. 2 people, maybe 3. One wore boots. Another had lighter shoes, maybe sneakers. No gear, no trash, just tracks. I left that afternoon. I didn't pack carefully. I just shoved everything into the back of the Subaru, kept the rifle across my lap, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit a town with cell service. I called the county sheriff's office and gave them the coordinates. I didn't want to go back even with police. They found signs of a camp not far from the cabin. Tarp lean-tos, burned cans, and a few stolen items. They told me it looked like transients, probably 2 men and maybe a younger person. No names, no arrests. They'd already moved on. I went back to St. Paul. I didn't tell anyone much about it. I sold the cabin to a logger that winter for almost nothing. I've never gone back to the woods since. I still think about those nights, the way they watched from the trees, waiting, not saying anything, just watching. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some haunted thing. It was real people, and somehow that's a whole lot worse. It was October of 2016 when I took a week off work and decided to drive up to a small cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, just outside of Elizabethton, Tennessee. I was 34 at the time, single, living in Knoxville, and working long hours at an IT company that had been slowly draining me. I needed a break. I needed quiet. I needed somewhere without screens or cell service. That's what led me to an old wooden cabin listed online for short-term rentals. It was isolated, right at the edge of the Cherokee National Forest. The photos showed nothing but trees, a small clearing, a thin dirt driveway, and a weathered little place with a tin roof and a narrow porch. It looked perfect, peaceful, a place to breathe. I packed light, a few changes of clothes, basic groceries, a flashlight, a folding knife, a book I'd been meaning to read, and a journal. I also threw in an old hatchet just because it felt like a cabin thing to bring. No TV, no laptop. I left my phone on airplane mode and stuffed it in my bag. I didn't even bring a charger. That was the whole point. Disconnect, recharge. The drive up was long and quiet. Once I left the main road, the signal disappeared, and the gravel roads turned to dirt. I had to check a printed map I'd brought with me, just to be safe. I drove another 30 minutes past any signs of people. No houses, no parked cars, just trees closing in on both sides and the road narrowing enough that I kept the windows cracked just to listen. At one point, I stopped the car, killed the engine, and just sat there, listening to the wind moving through the forest. It was the quietest place I'd ever been. I found the driveway almost by accident. A thin break in the trees. No signs, no mailbox. The dirt was worn from time, but there were still 2 tire tracks that led up a short hill. I followed it carefully and came up on the cabin. It looked just like the photos, small, rustic, with wood that had turned gray and soft from years of weather. The roof was intact, the porch sagging a little but nothing serious. The front door was stiff when I opened it, but it wasn't locked. Inside, it was all one room plus a tiny bathroom in the back. A twin bed, an old wood stove, a small counter with a sink that pulled from a rain barrel outside. No electricity, no running water. Just a kerosene lantern, some firewood, and a rusted-out propane stove that barely worked. It was perfect. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, cleaned a little, got a fire going in the stove, and sat on the porch for hours, listening to nothing. The kind of silence that hums in your ears because there's nothing else. I made soup from a can, read until sunset, and fell asleep early. That night, I woke up once from a sound outside, a branch snapping, maybe an animal, maybe just the woods settling. I stayed still and listened, but it didn't come again. I drifted back to sleep. The next few days were the kind I had wanted. Quiet mornings, warm coffee on the porch, walks down the narrow game trails that wound through the trees. I found a stream about a mile out and sat there for hours, watching the water move over smooth stones. I didn't see a single person. No voices, no engines, nothing. By the 4th day, I was starting to forget what the world outside even felt like. But then things started to feel off. It was small things at first. I noticed my folding knife wasn't where I'd left it. I'd put it on the shelf near the bed before going to sleep, but the next morning it was on the floor under the edge of the blanket. I assumed I knocked it over in the night, but I hadn't moved in my sleep that much. Then the food. I had brought a cooler with ice packs and kept it near the shaded back wall of the cabin. One morning I found the lid open slightly. A pack of beef jerky was missing, and a small jar of peanut butter had the lid off. I thought maybe an animal got in, maybe a raccoon, but the cooler was heavy, and the lid took force to open. It didn't feel like an animal. On the 5th night, I woke up suddenly. It was around 2:30 a.m. I remember looking at my watch in the dark. The room was cold. The fire in the stove had gone out. But it wasn't that. It was the sound. Not loud, not sharp. Just the soft creaking of the porch boards. One step, then another. Very slow, very deliberate. I laid still in the bed, eyes wide open, straining to hear. 3 more steps, then silence. I reached slowly for my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the cabin, lighting up dust in the air, and spilled across the door. It was closed. I moved to the window and shined the light out across the porch. Nothing. I opened the door and scanned the clearing. Nothing moved. No wind, no animals. Just dead silence. I barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I found footprints. In the dirt just beyond the porch, right at the edge of where the light didn't reach. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. Adult-sized. Clear prints in the soft dirt. The toes, the arch, the heel. They went off into the woods and disappeared. My stomach dropped. I stood there, staring at them for a long time. It wasn't a hiker. No one hikes barefoot in this kind of terrain. No one should have even been out here. I hadn't seen a soul in 5 days. I didn't know what to do. I kept telling myself it could have been old. Maybe someone had come through a week before, but they were too clear, too fresh. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking the tree line. Nothing. No signs of anyone. That day I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the hatchet with me. Every small sound made my skin crawl. Around noon, I walked the trail down to where I'd seen the stream. I needed to clear my head. As I passed through a patch of thicker woods, I noticed something odd off to the right. About 30 yards from the trail, tucked between two trees, was a small pile of rocks, too neat to be natural, stacked like a marker. I walked over and studied it. There was something under the top stone, a strip of cloth, dark blue. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve, frayed, dirty, and stiff. I left it there. Back at the cabin, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had 2 days left. I didn't feel safe. Something was wrong. I didn't want to be alone out here anymore. I told myself I'd leave at first light. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lantern burning low. I kept the hatchet by the bed. I lay under the blanket, listening. Around midnight, the woods came alive with sound. Not animals, movement, branches snapping, soft footsteps in the leaves. Then, a sharp knock on the back wall of the cabin. Just one. Then silence. I didn't move. My breathing felt too loud in my own ears. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then another sound, the front doorknob. A slow, soft rattle. Not hard enough to open it. Just testing. It stopped. Then another knock, this time right by the window. I didn't shine my light. I didn't move. I waited, frozen. At some point near dawn, the sounds stopped. The birds began to stir. Light started to creep in through the trees. I stood up, every joint stiff and sore, and opened the door slowly. Nothing, but again in the dirt, footprints, this time circling the cabin. Barefoot, just one set, not running, walking. I left everything behind. I grabbed my bag, keys in hand, and walked fast to the car. As I pulled onto the road and started driving, I felt tears in my eyes. Not from fear exactly, just from relief. The feeling of getting away, of escaping something I still didn't understand. I didn't call the police. What could I say? That someone walked around my cabin barefoot at night? That I heard noises? I didn't even know who to report it to. I just drove home, locked my door, and didn't leave for 3 days. A week later, I looked up the cabin listing online. It was gone, removed completely, no trace of it on the site. I searched the owner's name from the booking email. Nothing, no records, no listings, like it had never existed. I even tried to look up property records for that section of the forest, but it was all public land. Nothing was supposed to be there. I still think about it sometimes. Who was out there? Why were they barefoot? How long had they been watching me? And most of all, what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did? It was late September 2018 when I decided to take a break from work. I was 32 back then, working in IT at a mid-sized firm in Boise, Idaho. The stress was catching up to me. Long hours, endless meetings, bad sleep. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and had a little money saved, so I figured I could afford a few days off-grid. I booked a small cabin up in the northern part of the state, near the Payette National Forest, about a 4-hour drive from where I lived. The cabin was remote. I found it through a website that rented out private land and off-the-grid properties. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no neighbors within a mile, but it did have solar power, a small generator, running water from a tank, and a wood-burning stove. The pictures made it look clean and simple. Wooden walls, single bed, table, kitchen area, and a deck that looked out over the woods. I left early in the morning, packed up my old Subaru Outback with a few groceries, a cooler full of food, some books, a flashlight, extra batteries, a first aid kit, a couple knives, and a sleeping bag just in case. I also brought a power bank, a set of walkie-talkies with extra batteries, and my laptop just for writing. I didn't plan on using it much. The drive was nice at first. I played some music, had coffee, and rolled down the window now and then to breathe the clean mountain air. As I got further into the forest, the roads turned to gravel, and I stopped seeing other cars. I had to use a paper map the owners left on the booking site to find the last stretch of the road. Took nearly 5 hours in total, but I found the place. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but it looked just like the photos, maybe even a little better. It sat on a patch of flat ground surrounded by tall pine trees, with no one around, just pure silence and forest in all directions. The porch was dusty, but the inside looked clean enough. A few spider webs in the corners, but nothing too bad. I unloaded everything, locked the car, and set up inside. The air smelled like pine needles and old wood. It was cold, but not freezing yet. The first day went well. I made coffee on the propane stove, unpacked, set up my stuff, and spent the afternoon reading a book on the deck. I went to bed early, maybe around 9. The night was dead quiet. No cars, no voices, no buzzing phones. Just the sound of trees swaying and a few birds. The second day, I went for a long walk through the woods behind the cabin. The path was rough, not really a trail, but there were gaps between the trees that made it easy to keep a general direction. I brought a compass just in case. I didn't go far, maybe a mile in and back, and took a few pictures with my phone even though there was no signal. I wanted to feel the place more. It had a calm to it. I remember thinking I could get used to it. That night, I cooked a can of soup, drank a beer, and sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket as the sun went down. On the third day, things started to change. I woke up to a strange sound outside, early in the morning. It was still dark. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel messing around. I heard a rustling, then a heavy step. One, then silence, then two more, slower. Not the kind of fast, skittish movement animals make. This sounded more cautious, like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed in bed, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I stayed still for what felt like 20 minutes. Eventually, I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and peeked out the window. Nothing, just trees. I told myself it was probably a bear, or maybe an elk. They were common in the area, and the steps could have just been the echo or weird acoustics of the forest. Still, I kept the flashlight close the rest of the night and barely slept. The next morning, I went out to check around the cabin. I walked slowly, scanning the ground. There were prints. Not boots, not paws, shoes. Sneakers, it looked like. Someone had walked past the cabin during the night, maybe 30 feet from the window. The prints came from the woods, curved around the cabin, and vanished into the trees. I followed them for a bit, but the forest floor was too dry, and the trail faded after 20 or 30 yards. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the main road. There were no other cabins nearby, no cars, nothing. I stayed close to the cabin for the rest of the day, uneasy. That night, I kept the lights off, locked the doors, and stayed up late listening again. I didn't hear anything this time, but sleep came in short bursts. On the fourth day, I made a decision to leave. I packed up early, threw everything back in the car, and started the drive back. About 10 minutes down the gravel road, I hit trouble. A large tree had fallen across the path, looked fresh, with green needles still clinging to the branches. It blocked the whole road. No way around it. I tried backing up to look for another way, but this was the only access road in or out, and the forest was too dense to go off-road. I got out, checked the tree. It was too big to move. I thought about using my small hatchet to try cutting through, but it would have taken hours, maybe a day. I checked my phone, still no signal. I hiked back to the cabin, grabbed one of the walkie-talkies and turned it on, hoping I could catch a ranger or someone on a frequency. Nothing, just static. I was stuck. I figured I'd wait it out. Maybe someone would come down the road in a day or two. The rental owner was supposed to check on the place once a week, so someone would eventually notice. I spent that afternoon sharpening the hatchet and gathering wood. If I was going to be stuck, I wanted to be ready. I boiled water, made coffee, and double-checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked. That night, I kept the lights off again, sat in the corner with a knife and flashlight, and waited. At some point after midnight, I heard it again. Steps, closer this time, slow, heavy, a crunch of twigs, then a pause, then more steps right outside the back wall. I stayed dead still. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't dare shine the flashlight. Whoever was out there didn't knock, didn't try to open anything. They just stood out there, breathing, maybe listening. Then the steps moved again, this time toward the side window. I ducked below the frame, gripping the knife so tight my hand cramped. The sound stopped again, then a light scratch like fingers brushing wood, and then nothing. I stayed like that until morning. When the sun came up, I finally dared to look outside. No one, but the prints were back. This time, they were all around the cabin. Circles, as if someone had walked around it slowly for hours, just pacing, watching. Something snapped in me then. I wasn't waiting anymore. I got the axe and started hacking the tree on the road. Hours passed. I broke twice for water and a granola bar. My hands blistered, my arms burned, but I didn't stop. I kept going, splinters flying, the blade dulling with every hit. Just before sundown, I managed to chop through enough that I could roll part of it off the road. It scratched the side of my car, but I didn't care. I raced back to the cabin, grabbed the rest of my gear, threw it in the car, and drove off. About 5 miles later, my phone got signal again. I called a friend, told him I was coming back. I didn't explain much. I just needed to hear someone's voice. The rest of the drive back was a blur. When I got home, I slept for almost a full day. I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard anything back. The owner of the cabin emailed me a few days later asking why I left early. I didn't respond. Weeks passed, then months. I stopped thinking about it all the time. I went back to work, got busy again, let it fade. But sometimes, when it's late and I hear something outside my window, that cold feeling creeps back. Someone was out there. They weren't trying to rob me. They didn't want anything. They just watched, waited. They had no reason. And that's the part that still gets to me. There was no ending to it. No name, no face, just footsteps in the dark. My name is Ian Walker, and I'm 39 years old. I work as a freelance construction planner, mostly remote these days. This happened in September of 2018. It was the last trip I ever took alone to a remote cabin. Back in early August that year, I found a listing on a site for off-grid getaways, this small cabin up in the Blue Ridge region of western Montana. It was deep in the woods, about 4 hours from Missoula. The photos showed a plain wooden structure surrounded by forest, with a small fire pit out front, an outhouse about 30 feet away, and a water pump off to the side. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no electricity, just a propane lantern, a stove, and a small bed. I booked it for the second week of September, planning to stay 6 days. The goal was to fully unplug, bring a stack of books, some food, a camera, and a notebook. It was a busy year, and I wanted total quiet. Felt like the right time. Work was between big projects, and I had just gotten out of a long relationship that ended messy. I told a couple of close friends where I was going, gave them GPS coordinates, and said I'd check in once I got back to town. I flew into Missoula on a Monday, picked up a rented 4x4, grabbed groceries and water, then drove out. It took longer than expected to get to the cabin. The dirt roads were worse than described, especially after the last mile where it turned into a barely marked trail through thick pine. The cabin itself sat in a natural clearing, ringed by tall trees that blocked most of the horizon. There were no neighbors for miles. I unloaded the gear from the truck, put the cooler in the shade, opened the windows, and swept out the cabin. Inside it was simple. A narrow bed with a foam mattress, a small table, a pair of chairs, and a shelf with a few old books and a first aid kit. There was a tin basin to wash up in, and a propane stove with one burner. That first night was peaceful. I built a small fire, read a couple chapters from an old paperback, and cooked a basic meal, just beans and rice with some sausage I brought. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I bundled into a flannel jacket and watched the fire burn low. The silence was thicker than I expected. It wasn't like being in a quiet neighborhood or park. It was complete silence. No hum of lights, no cars in the distance. Just the occasional crack of a branch or the call of a bird before dusk. When I turned in, I remember thinking it was the best sleep I'd get in months. It wasn't. That came later after I left. On Tuesday, I woke up early and made coffee over the stove. There was a trail that circled behind the cabin, and I spent most of the morning following it, mapping the area in my notebook. I carried a small compass, a watch, and a pocket knife. I wasn't too deep into the woods, but far enough that I knew I had to keep track. Around noon, I turned back, made lunch, and spent the afternoon writing. That night was just like the first. Cool, quiet, calm. I heard some noises from the woods around 2 a.m., but nothing unusual, probably deer. Wednesday started normal. The air was crisp and the sky was pale blue. I spent some time chopping up wood from the pile behind the cabin, then took more time to clean out the basin and refill water. I had just finished making coffee when I saw the first sign something wasn't right. There were boot prints, fresh ones, about 15 feet from the cabin's front step, leading out of the woods. I hadn't seen them there before. They weren't mine. I wear size 10 hiking boots with a very specific tread, and these were bigger. Size 12 maybe. The pattern was more aggressive too, like work boots or tactical gear. They came in from the northeast tree line and ended near the pump, then doubled back into the woods. It didn't scare me immediately. I figured maybe a forest ranger came through early or someone hunting nearby. It wasn't technically private land, just isolated. I shrugged it off and kept going through my day, but it stuck in the back of my mind. By evening, it was getting cloudy. I built a fire anyway and made a simple dinner. As I sat by the fire, I kept looking toward the woods. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Around 3 a.m., I heard movement, slow, steady footfalls on dry leaves. I held my breath and waited. It stopped after a few minutes. On Thursday, I did a wider sweep around the cabin. I found more boot prints behind the outhouse, circling. Not mine. Not old either. The ground was soft from rain a few days earlier, and these hadn't dried out or cracked. I spent the rest of the morning on edge, pausing at every sound. That afternoon, I wrote down a list of what I'd do if someone tried to break in. It felt ridiculous, but also necessary. I didn't have a gun, just a hunting knife and an axe. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the lantern low and the door locked. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard steps again. This time closer, slower. I waited, eyes wide open, barely breathing. Then I heard it, faint creak of wood. Someone was stepping on the porch. The sound stopped at the door. I didn't move. I lay frozen for an hour, straining to hear more. Nothing. In the morning, I went outside with the knife. The prints were there again, right on the porch. Big boots, slightly worn tread. They faced the door, paused, then turned back into the woods. I felt sick. I wanted to leave. I packed some stuff into the truck, but hesitated. It was a long drive, and the road out was steep and rough. I told myself maybe I was overreacting. Friday was quiet, too quiet. I kept the axe close and stayed inside most of the day. I made simple food, read, and wrote. I couldn't focus. I kept looking out the window, just trees and shadows. That night, I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the dark and listened. At 2:04 a.m. exactly, my watch glowed in the dark. I heard it again. A soft crunch of steps, slow and steady. Then silence. At 2:12 a.m., I heard metal. The pump. Someone was trying it. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. Then it stopped. No more sounds. On Saturday morning, I walked to the pump and found smudges on the handle. Muddy, partial fingerprints. I tried to wipe them off, but they were stained into the rusted surface. I felt like I was being watched. I went to pack everything up for good. That's when I found it. On the side of the cabin, etched into the wood with something sharp, was a word, stay. It was carved low, near the corner, where you wouldn't see it unless you were behind the outhouse or chopping wood. Deep cuts, not fresh but not old either. Maybe a few days old. That was it. I threw everything in the truck and left. Didn't clean up. Didn't look back. It took 5 hours to get back to the nearest gas station. I called my friend from the parking lot and told him what happened. He told me to call the sheriff, but I didn't. What would I say? That I heard noises? Saw some boots? Back home, I had a hard time sleeping for a while. I kept checking locks, waking up at odd hours. I never went back to Montana. I still don't know who was out there or why they kept coming back at night. Maybe a hunter gone off-grid. Maybe a squatter. Maybe someone who didn't want me there. What gets me most is the timing. always between 1 and 3 a.m. Always slow, deliberate steps. No attempt to talk, no sounds of cars or motors. Just walking, stopping, watching, maybe waiting. I never figured it out. Never will. But I do know one thing. When someone carves "stay" into the side of a cabin, they don't mean it in a friendly way. My name's Eric. I'm 34 years old, and this happened back in late October 2019. At the time, I was working as a freelance graphic designer, mostly staying home and handling everything online. That kind of freedom let me get away from the city sometimes, especially when things got overwhelming. I'd just come off a string of tight deadline projects, barely sleeping or eating properly, and my head felt like it was full of static. I needed out. So, I rented a cabin in upstate Maine through a small site that specialized in off-grid getaways. It wasn't some luxury Airbnb cabin with Wi-Fi and fancy appliances. It was real old school. Wood stove for heat, no electricity, no plumbing beyond a basic pump for cold water. One room, a small kitchen area, and a loft bed. The place sat near the edge of a forest preserve, with no other homes or cabins for at least 5 or 6 miles. It was exactly what I needed. At least that's what I thought going in. I drove up early in the morning from Boston. The last stretch of the road was narrow and unpaved, more of a gravel trail cutting through thick woods than anything else. The trees were mostly bare, just clinging to a few orange and yellow leaves. It had rained the day before, so the dirt road was slick and soft in places. My little SUV wasn't exactly built for that, but I managed. When I got there, I found the cabin just like the owner had described. Tiny, grayish-brown, built low to the ground, and tucked into a slight clearing that opened up into dense woods. The driveway just kind of ended at the edge of a sloped patch of land where the cabin sat. There was a narrow path off to the right, barely wide enough to walk through, that looked like it led deeper into the forest. I made a mental note to avoid that. Hiking alone out here wasn't the smartest idea. I got the key from under a loose rock near the front door, opened up, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dry wood and dust. It wasn't dirty, just old. The kind of old where the floorboards creak no matter where you step, and the windows rattle if there's even a light breeze. The place had a sort of rustic charm, and after unloading my bags and lighting a fire in the stove, I felt myself start to relax for the first time in weeks. The first couple of days were uneventful. I'd wake up with the sun, make coffee on the propane burner, and spend hours sitting on the small porch with a blanket over my legs, watching the wind move through the trees. No phone signal, no distractions, just the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional creaking of trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I welcomed it. It was on the 4th day that things started to feel off. I woke up around 6 a.m., just before dawn. The air inside the cabin was freezing, so I got the fire going right away. While I waited for the place to warm up, I stepped outside to take a leak. It had rained again during the night, and everything was damp. The sky was overcast, casting a grayish light over everything. I noticed something strange as I stood on the porch. There were footprints in the mud. Not mine, they were too big and had a different tread pattern than my hiking boots. They came from the direction of the narrow trail, stopped about 10 feet from my porch, then turned and went back the way they came. I stood there for a long time just staring. The tracks weren't fresh, maybe a few hours old at most, but still, someone had walked right up to my cabin in the middle of the night and left without knocking or announcing themselves. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter got turned around? Maybe someone from the preserve came out to check the area? But there was no reason to come that close and then leave without making contact. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping busy. I read, jotted some notes in my journal, and made simple meals. But I kept checking the window, glancing toward that trail. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to some creak or soft thump outside. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard crunching, like someone walking slowly across wet leaves. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and held my breath. The sound didn't come again, but I stayed awake until the sun came up, just listening. The next morning, I went outside and scanned the area around the cabin. I didn't see anything at first, but when I walked around the back, I found more footprints. Same size, same tread. They circled behind the cabin and stopped about 5 feet from the back wall, then disappeared into the trees. That's when I decided I needed to get out of there. Maybe not that second, but soon. I didn't want to wait until something worse happened. I packed up most of my stuff, loaded the car, and planned to leave the next morning. I'd already paid for the full week, but I didn't care anymore. That night, I kept the fire low so the light wouldn't be visible from outside. I sat in the dark, wide awake, holding the small hatchet the owner had left next to the woodpile. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. Not fast, not loud, just slow, deliberate steps on wet ground. I turned off the small battery lantern I had on and moved to the window. I couldn't see much through the glass, just the outline of trees and darkness beyond them. But then something moved. A figure, just barely visible. They were standing a few feet from the tree line, not moving, just watching the cabin. My stomach dropped. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark shape. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, staring through the glass, waiting for them to do something. But they didn't. After what felt like forever, they turned and walked back into the woods. I waited until daylight before I moved. I grabbed my last few things, tossed them into the car, and got out of there. The trail out was even more of a mess after the rain, and I nearly got stuck twice, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to a place with people. On the way out, I stopped at a small gas station about 20 miles from the cabin. The guy behind the counter looked like he'd been working there his whole life. I asked him casually if there were a lot of hunters in the area. He gave me a strange look and said hunting wasn't allowed anywhere near that stretch of woods. It was a protected zone. I asked if anyone else lived nearby, or if there were rangers or staff who might check on the place. He shook his head and told me the preserve didn't really get visitors. Too remote, he said. Too much wildlife, not enough trails. Most people avoided it. I didn't tell him about the footprints or the figure in the woods. I just nodded, paid for gas, and drove home. It's been years now, and I haven't been back to Maine since. I still don't know who or what that person was. Maybe some drifter living off the grid. Maybe someone hiding out. Or maybe just some local messing with me. I'll never know. But one thing still bothers me. I didn't notice it at first, not until a few weeks later when I was going through the photos I'd taken at the cabin. I'd snapped a picture of the porch on the second day, the morning after I arrived. Just a casual shot of the trees and the path leading off into the woods. When I zoomed in, way in the background, almost hidden behind a tree, was a figure, standing still, watching. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to leave everything behind for a little while. I was 31 years old, burned out from work, barely sleeping, and just done with the non-stop noise of my life in Kansas City. The idea came on a random Tuesday morning. I was standing in line at a gas station, holding a black coffee and a granola bar, and the guy ahead of me was talking about how his cousin owned a cabin in northern Minnesota, somewhere near Ely, and how he rented it out cheap in the off-season. I don't know why I asked for the contact info. I wasn't planning to, but 2 weeks later, I was loading my old Toyota Tacoma with basic supplies and heading north with the kind of desperation that makes you leave your phone off and your email unchecked. The cabin was tiny. Not cute tiny like those luxury microhouses you see online. Just a single-floor wooden rectangle with a short, sloped roof and one chimney. It sat about 50 yards back from a gravel trail that looked like it hadn't seen regular use in years. No electricity, no running water, just a small wood stove, a pile of firewood stacked under a tarp, and a water pump about 30 feet from the front door. The whole place smelled like old cedar and stale smoke. I got there on a Thursday afternoon. The sky was already darkening, the trees bare, the wind sharp and steady. I dropped my bag on the floor, checked for rodents or anything worse, then unloaded the rest. Cans of soup, a small camping stove, a few gallons of water just in case, a good flashlight, a hand crank radio, and a solid hunting knife I'd bought mostly for the illusion of safety. I didn't plan to do much. Just read, maybe write in my notebook, maybe sit on the porch and let my brain slow down. For the first 3 days, it was exactly what I needed. I'd wake up around 7, boil water on the stove, sip instant coffee while watching the lights spread across the trees. No cars, no voices, no internet. I kept a small fire going in the stove, just enough to keep the chill off, and at night I'd wrap myself in the thick wool blankets the owner had left folded in the corner. I kept my phone off. No reception anyway. The first thing that felt off happened on the 4th morning. I'd woken up around 5 a.m. to pee, and when I stepped outside, I noticed a single boot print in the frozen dirt about 5 feet from the front door. Not mine. I wear size 10, and this print was easily a 12 or 13. Deep too, whoever it was, they were heavy or carrying something. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. It wasn't fresh. The edges had softened a little, like it had been made late the night before. I looked around. No other prints, just the one. I told myself it was probably old. Maybe someone had been hiking through and walked near the cabin before I arrived. It had been cold, but not freezing every night. Maybe it had just preserved the shape. That made enough sense to go back inside. Still, I pushed the little table in front of the door that night before bed, just in case. The next day, I decided to walk a little farther down the trail behind the cabin. I hadn't gone past maybe a quarter mile since I'd arrived. I brought the knife with me, clipped to my belt, not because I thought I'd need it, but because it made me feel better. About a mile in, I found something strange. It was a tree, a birch maybe 40 feet tall, snapped clean in half about 12 feet up. Not sawed, not cut, snapped. The upper part lay nearby, stripped of its branches as if someone or something had twisted it until it gave way. I looked around again. Nothing but trees and more trees. I marked the spot on my mental map and headed back. That night, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Started around 1 a.m. I'd been asleep, but something woke me. Maybe the creak of the boards outside. I held my breath. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate crunching in the frozen ground, maybe 15 feet from the cabin. Then 10 feet. Then right up against the wall. Whoever it was didn't knock. They didn't try the door. Just stood there, breathing. I didn't move. I didn't even sit up. I just stayed still under the blanket, my ears straining. After maybe 2 minutes, the sound faded, back the way it came. I stayed awake until the gray light of morning. When I finally stepped outside around 8, there were no new prints, no signs of anyone or anything. I thought maybe I dreamed it, but the side of the cabin, just below the one small window, had a smear on it. A grayish, greasy handprint, long fingers, bigger than mine. I left it there. I didn't touch it. That day, I didn't leave the cabin. I kept the knife with me even inside. I spent hours just sitting at the little table, watching the trees, listening for anything out of place. I thought about leaving. I even packed my bag. But it was a 6-hour drive back to the city, and something in me didn't want to run. It felt like giving up, like losing to something I couldn't even see. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner farthest from the door with the flashlight in my hand and the knife across my lap. The fire burned low. Around 2:30, I heard it again. This time, it was faster. Movement from behind the cabin, quick footsteps in the leaves. Then silence. Then something scratching lightly at the wall. Not a bear, not a raccoon. It was too intentional. At sunrise, I found 3 small rocks stacked on the front porch, perfectly balanced. No animals did that. I stayed another night. I don't know why. Maybe part of me thought I'd finally catch whoever was messing with me. I stacked wood by the door. I locked the window shutters from the inside. I even wedged a branch through the handle to brace it. Then I waited. That night, around 1 a.m., I heard something heavier. Not footsteps, more like dragging. Something being pulled across the dirt. I got up, slowly, and looked out the small slit between the shutters. I couldn't see anything. Then something hit the side of the cabin. Hard. Once. Then again. Then silence. When I opened the door in the morning, the ground was scraped, like someone had dragged a body-sized sack from the woods to the wall and back again. There was hair caught on a nail near the corner. Human hair. Short. Dark. I threw up behind the cabin. That was the final straw. I packed everything in 10 minutes. I didn't clean. I didn't fold the blankets. I didn't refill the water jugs. I just grabbed my bag and got in the truck. When I turned the key, it didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I sat there for a full minute, shaking, then popped the hood. Nothing looked cut, but I wasn't a mechanic. When I went to open the driver's side door again, I saw it on the window. Another handprint, bigger, fainter, like someone had just pressed it there and waited. I grabbed the emergency satellite beacon from the glove box. I'd bought it as an afterthought, a just in case. I pressed the SOS. A blinking red light started flashing. I waited inside the truck, knife in hand. I didn't leave the cab for hours. The rescue guy showed up 4 hours later in a green snowmobile. Middle-aged, heavy-set. Didn't say much. He just looked at the cabin, then at me and asked if I was all right. I nodded. He towed my truck down the trail to a service road where a flatbed was waiting. Later, a mechanic found sugar in the gas tank. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked about the owner. I never told anyone the full story. Not even my brother, who helped me get the truck cleaned and running again. I sold it a month later. To this day, I don't know who was out there, or why they picked me. I don't know if they were watching from the beginning or if I stumbled into something I shouldn't have. But I do know this. I was not alone out there, not even for a second. And whoever was out there didn't want me to leave. But I did, and I'm not going back. I was 36 when I went out to Grey Pines for a break from the mess of my life. It was the fall of 2021, early October, right before the first frost usually rolls in up north. I'd just gotten through a bitter divorce and lost my job at a construction firm 3 months before. I was living off savings and just drifting, not really thinking straight. A buddy of mine had once mentioned this old hunting cabin his uncle used to own, said it was sitting empty for years, tucked away in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near a dried-up town called Embers Creek, said I could use it if I wanted some time alone. I took him up on the offer without thinking too much about it. The cabin was a 5-hour drive from where I was staying in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The roads turned from pavement to gravel after the 4th hour. You could tell fewer and fewer people came this way anymore. The forests got thicker, the houses more scattered, and before long, I didn't see anyone else on the road, just pines and the occasional rusted-out mailbox. I pulled up to the cabin around 3 p.m. It was a squat, weathered place, single-story, with a front porch that sagged a little in the middle. The wood siding was gray and dry, faded from years of sun and rain. There were 2 small windows in the front, both covered with old mosquito screens. The whole area smelled like pine needles and cold dirt. No cell signal, no sounds besides wind and birds. That was the point. I wanted quiet. I didn't want to see or hear from anyone. I just wanted to reset my brain. Inside, the cabin was basic. 1 big room with a bed in the corner, a tiny kitchen, a cast iron stove in the middle for heat, and a small bathroom that looked like it hadn't been used in a decade. There was no electricity, just a few old oil lamps and a pile of firewood stacked in the corner. The kitchen had a hand pump for water and a rusted-out propane stove that, somehow, still worked when I lit it. There was no fridge, so I brought a cooler filled with ice and enough food to last me 10 days. Canned stuff, dried meals, and a couple packs of beer. The first night, I drank a little too much and passed out early. Woke up to total silence at 2 a.m. Not even wind, the kind of quiet that feels like pressure in your ears. I lay there in the dark, listening to nothing. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The days were slow. I spent them chopping firewood, reading a book I barely paid attention to, and walking the trails that ran behind the cabin. They twisted through the forest, tight with brush and fallen branches, but you could still follow them if you looked for boot prints in the dirt. Old trails, maybe from hunters years ago. By the 4th day, I started noticing things that felt off. Small, easy-to-ignore things. The first was the sound. Every morning, around 5:30, I'd wake up to a rhythmic thudding noise coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker, or maybe a deer hitting antlers against a tree, but it was too steady, like a slow, dull pounding. 3 or 4 hits, then silence. It would stop before the sun was fully up. I tried to brush it off, but it started happening every morning. Always the same pattern. I told myself it was just some kind of natural thing. Probably a branch falling. Maybe an animal. Nothing to worry about. Then there were the tracks. On the 6th day, I woke up and went outside to take a piss. I glanced over to where the firewood pile was and noticed footprints in the dirt. Human ones, clear as day. They weren't mine. I hadn't been over there since I first brought in the firewood. And these prints were fresh. No scuffing or fading. The dirt was a little wet from the rain the night before, and the prints stood out sharp and dark. Bare feet, no shoes, the toes dug in deep. Whoever it was, they were heavy. I looked around the trees, half expecting someone to be standing there watching me, but there was nothing. I stood still for a long time, just staring at those prints. Eventually, I brushed some leaves over them and went back inside. I didn't sleep much that night. By day 7, the woods didn't feel empty anymore. I'd be walking a trail and hear crunching behind me. Soft, slow, like someone stepping exactly when I did, mirroring me. I stopped a few times, spun around fast. Nothing, no one, but the feeling didn't go away. That feeling of being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder every few minutes. My heart would beat fast and sharp in my chest for no reason. I started leaving the cabin door locked during the day. At night, I pushed the heavy kitchen table against it. There was no real reason why, just a deep, uneasy feeling that built more and more. On the 8th night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping the side of the cabin. Not an animal, something slow, dragging. I sat up in bed and waited, listening hard. The scraping stopped for a moment. Then I heard the dull thud again. That same rhythm from before. 3 hits. Pause. 3 more. It was closer now, right outside the wall where my bed was. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, keeping the light off. I didn't open the curtains. Just stood there, heart pounding, trying to hear more. But the sound had stopped again. I stood there for almost 10 minutes before crawling back to bed. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. There were long, vertical marks on the wood, like something heavy had been dragged across it. Claw marks maybe, but wider, not clean, like they were made with something dull. I considered packing up and leaving, but a part of me didn't want to. I told myself I was overreacting. I'd been alone too long. Cabin fever, maybe. I still had 2 days left. I figured I'd stick it out. That was a mistake. On the 9th day, I decided to try hiking deeper into the woods. I thought maybe if I got out and moved around more, I'd shake off the paranoia. I took one of the older trails I hadn't walked yet. This one was more overgrown. The trees were tighter together, and the ground was covered in moss and wet leaves. I followed it for an hour before I found something strange. There was a clearing, maybe the size of a basketball court, right in the middle of nowhere. In the center of it, there was a circle of stones, deliberately placed, not random. Inside the circle, the grass was flattened, like someone had been sleeping or lying there. The weirdest part was a small pile of bones stacked in the middle. Clean, picked dry, looked like raccoon or maybe a fox. I didn't touch anything, just stood there, heart beating in my throat. Then I noticed the tree carvings. All around the edge of the clearing, the trees had markings, cuts into the bark. Vertical lines, some long, some short, always grouped in 3s. They looked recent. The sap still bled from the wounds. I turned and walked back fast. Didn't run, but close. That night was the worst. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I kept the lamp burning low, sat in bed with a hatchet in my lap. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard it again, the scraping, right outside. Then footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. The doorknob rattled. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the knob stopped turning, and the porch creaked as something walked away. I waited until sunrise to even move again. That morning, I didn't think. I just packed, fast, shoved everything into my duffel, grabbed my cooler, didn't even clean up. I was ready to leave when I noticed the back window, shattered. Not broken like someone threw something through it, broken inward, glass all over the floor. Whatever it was, it came inside. I looked around, every part of me screaming to get out. That's when I noticed the marks on the inside wall. Same as the trees. Sets of 3 vertical slashes, etched deep into the wood near the stove. I didn't stay to see more. I jumped in the truck and peeled out of there, gravel spitting out behind me. I drove 6 hours straight until I hit a gas station with cell service. I didn't call the cops. What would I say? That someone scratched my wall and stood on my porch at night? I never went back. A month later, I asked my buddy if he knew anything weird about that cabin. He just shrugged, said his uncle used to say the woods were full of old paths people shouldn't walk, but that it was just backwoods talk. Local stories. I haven't seen him since. Haven't talked to anyone else who's been out that way. I've looked up Embers Creek on maps, but it doesn't even show up anymore. Just forest. Now, 3 years later, I still think about it. That circle in the woods, the footprints, the scratches, the way something knew I was there. I tell myself it was just some hermit, some off-grid lunatic. That's easier to accept than anything else. But sometimes at night, I still hear that sound in my head. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more, and I keep thinking, what if I hadn't left? What if I stayed just one more night? I think that was the point of the sound, a warning, one that I almost didn't listen to. It was October of 2016 when I decided to take a solo trip up north. I was 32 years old, working in IT at a company in St. Louis, Missouri. I'd been through a rough stretch, overworked, not sleeping well, and just mentally drained. I hadn't taken a real break in over 2 years, and I figured I was due. A buddy of mine had mentioned this cabin his family used to rent near Stillwater Lake in northern Minnesota. Said it was quiet, no cell service, no people, just trees, water, and silence. That sounded exactly like what I needed. I found the place online. It looked small but clean. A-frame style, single story, right on the edge of the lake, surrounded by dense forest. The photos showed a small dock out back, an old rowboat flipped upside down next to a fire pit, and an outhouse off to the side. No electricity, but it had a propane stove and a little heater. They said to bring your own water since the well was unreliable. I booked it for 10 days. I drove up from St. Louis the first week of October. Took me about 12 hours. The last 2 were slow, winding roads through thick trees. The air felt different out there. Colder, sharper, cleaner. I stopped in a small town called Ashwood to stock up on supplies. Canned food, a few jugs of water, a lantern, extra propane, and a small first aid kit. The guy at the hardware store asked where I was headed. When I told him Stillwater Lake, he just nodded and said, "You'll have the place to yourself this time of year." I didn't think much of it at the time. The road to the cabin was rough, just a long dirt track with potholes and overgrown brush scraping the sides of my car. I had to slow down to a crawl. I remember thinking, no one's been out here in a while. When I finally pulled up, the place looked just like the pictures, old, but not falling apart. There was a padlock on the front door and a small note in a plastic bag pinned to the frame. "Welcome. Please relock when you leave. Paul." That was the owner. Inside was simple. One main room with a bed on one end and a little kitchenette on the other. A small table with 2 chairs. No fridge. The stove worked fine once I got the propane hooked up. There was a stack of wood by the heater. I unpacked, put away the food, lit the lantern, and just sat for a while. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in a way that made everything feel hushed, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The first 2 days were perfect. I fished in the mornings, read books in the afternoons, and cooked simple meals at night. I kept a little journal, mostly just to remember what I did each day. The quiet started to settle into me, and I felt myself letting go of everything I'd been carrying. I slept better than I had in months. Then, around the 3rd night, something shifted. Started small. I was chopping wood around 4 p.m. when I noticed boot prints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. Not mine. I'd been wearing hiking shoes, and these were clearly deeper and wider. Big, thick treads like from heavy work boots. They went toward the dock, then back up the path that led into the woods. I thought maybe a hunter had passed through. The area was remote, but not completely off limits. I told myself it was nothing. That night, I locked the door from the inside, something I hadn't bothered with before. I remember lying in bed, staring at the dark rafters, listening. No animals, no bugs, no birds, just stillness. And under that, something else. A feeling I couldn't shake, like I was being watched. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. My folding camp chair, the one I kept out by the fire pit, was gone. Just gone. I looked all over for it. Even checked the lake's edge in case the wind had knocked it into the water. Nothing. It was like someone had taken it. I told myself maybe it was animals, or maybe I'd put it somewhere and forgotten, but I knew I hadn't. I felt something in my chest then, like pressure. I didn't like the feeling. On the 5th day, I woke up to find the front door slightly open. Not all the way, just cracked an inch. I was sure I had locked it. I checked my pockets for the key. Still there. Nothing inside the cabin looked disturbed. I checked my food, my bag, the journal. All untouched. But it didn't make sense. If someone had come in, why not take anything? Why not make it obvious? Why just leave the door open? That day, I didn't go fishing. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping the hatchet nearby. I checked the woods, walked about 50 feet in each direction, trying to find more boot prints, more signs of someone being there. I didn't find any, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept thinking of that chair, of the door, of how quiet everything was. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made me sit up. I kept the lantern on until the fuel ran out. At some point, I started hearing soft sounds outside. Not animals, heavier. Slow footsteps on dirt and dry leaves. A couple times they circled the cabin. I held my breath and waited, but they never stopped at the door, never knocked, never tried to come in. The next morning, I found something new. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly in front of the steps. 5 of them, different shapes and colors, placed carefully like a marker. That's when I knew for sure. Someone was messing with me. Not animals, not my imagination. Person, a real person walking around out there at night, watching, leaving things. I packed that afternoon. I planned to leave early the next morning. I didn't want to drive the long road at night, not with how bad it was. I checked everything twice, made sure the car was fueled and ready, then brought my stuff inside and locked the door. That night was the worst. Started around midnight. A soft tapping on the back wall of the cabin. Just one tap every 10 seconds or so. Light like a single finger, then silence, then another. I sat up, heart pounding, not knowing what to do. The tapping moved, slowly, toward the side of the cabin, then the front. Then it stopped. I waited, 30 minutes, an hour. Then I heard the door handle rattle. Just once, then nothing. I sat there in the dark, frozen. I had the hatchet in my hand, breathing shallow, listening for anything. Nothing else happened that night. I didn't sleep. At first light, I threw my stuff in the car and started driving. The road felt even longer this time, and I kept checking my mirrors. I didn't see anyone. No cars. No people. Just trees. I got to Ashwood by noon. I didn't stop. I kept driving until I hit the interstate. When I finally pulled into my apartment back in St. Louis, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I never reported it. What was I going to say? Someone walked around my cabin at night? No one would care. No one would believe it was serious. Nothing was stolen. I wasn't hurt, but it stuck with me. The chair, the door, the footprints, the rocks, the tapping. All of it felt like a warning. Not random, not just someone messing around. Whoever it was didn't want to hurt me. They wanted me to know they were there, that they could come in if they wanted to, that I wasn't alone. A week later, I checked the listing. The cabin was still available. Same photos, same price. I didn't leave a review, and I never went camping alone again. I was 29 when I decided to take some time off and go on a solo retreat. Life in Cincinnati had become too much. I was working as a systems analyst at a mid-sized company that had just been acquired, and everything felt like it was falling apart. Layoffs, budget cuts, too many meetings. I was burned out. It was early October 2013. I booked a small, private cabin up in northern Michigan, near a tiny place called Crystal Hill, which wasn't much more than a couple of gas stations, a diner, and a bait shop. The cabin was about 8 miles off the main road, surrounded by woods thick enough to swallow all sound. It belonged to a guy I found through a small travel site. He only rented it out in the fall when his hunting season ended. Said it was best for people who wanted peace and quiet. It didn't have Wi-Fi, barely had cell service, no television, just a wood stove, a gas heater, a radio, and enough supplies for a couple weeks. I brought a stack of books, my camera, some old trail maps, and a big notebook to write in. The idea was to unplug, recharge, maybe even figure out if I wanted to quit my job entirely. The first 2 days were perfect. Cold air, orange leaves, the kind of silence you can feel in your bones. I chopped wood in the morning, read by the window in the afternoons, and slept for 10 hours at a time. The only noise was the occasional gust of wind and the crunch of squirrels or deer in the underbrush. The cabin was small, just one room with a little kitchen off to the side, a wood stove in the middle, and a cot against the wall. The front had a porch that looked out over a slope of trees. There was no real backyard, just more woods. It was isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. The first strange thing happened on the third night. I'd gone to bed around 10. The stove was burning low, and I'd cracked a window because the heat had gotten dry and stale. I remember waking up because of a sound, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. It was a click, then a sort of dragging sound, like metal on wood. I sat up in bed. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something getting into the firewood I'd stacked by the side of the porch. I didn't go outside. I waited, listened. It stopped after maybe a minute. I told myself it was nothing, just forest noises. Maybe a branch fell. But I left the window closed that time and kept the hatchet I used for firewood inside from then on. The next morning, I went out to check. The woodpile was fine. Nothing disturbed. I walked around the cabin, but didn't see anything odd. I shook it off. The fifth night was colder. I layered up before bed and made sure the fire was good and strong. Around midnight, I woke up again. Same sound, a click, then dragging. But this time it was closer, definitely outside, right outside the cabin wall. I sat still, listening. My heart was pounding in my ears. The dragging went on for maybe 30 seconds, then silence. I didn't hear footsteps, just that weird scrape. In the morning, I found something I didn't expect. Just under the window, the one I'd opened 2 nights before, there were marks in the dirt. Not footprints, more like lines, like someone had dragged a stick or a piece of metal along the ground. It curved around the side of the cabin, disappearing into the woods. That was the first time I started to feel real fear. Not full-on panic, but the kind that sits in your chest and makes you hyper-aware of every creak and crack. I told myself again it was an animal, maybe a porcupine, maybe a coyote dragging something. I didn't let myself think about anything else, but I started keeping the hatchet under the cot. That day, I went hiking along the trail behind the cabin. I needed to clear my head. It was an old trail, barely used and covered in fallen leaves. I walked for maybe an hour, following it until it started looping back. The trees were beautiful. I tried to relax. On the way back, maybe 200 yards from the cabin, I found something strange in the woods. It was a pile of rocks, stacked deliberately, not naturally. About waist-high. In the middle of it was a tin can, crushed flat. Next to it was an old boot, just one. It looked like it had been there a long time. It didn't make sense. There were no other cabins nearby, no campsites, no trash, just this weird little pile, almost like a marker. I took a photo and walked back fast. That night I didn't sleep. The noise came again. Click, drag, click, drag. I sat on the cot with my jacket on and the hatchet across my lap. I didn't look out the window. I didn't move. At 2:43 a.m., there was a knock on the back wall. Not the door, The wall. 3 slow, heavy knocks, like someone using the side of their fist or a piece of wood. Not testing it, just letting me know they were there. Then silence. The next morning, I found another set of drag marks. This time, they came all the way around the cabin and ended at the steps of the front porch. There was no knock on the door, just the back wall. I didn't have cell reception strong enough to call anyone. I tried texting a friend to come pick me up early, but it didn't send. The signal kept cutting out. I stood on the roof of the porch holding the phone above my head for 10 minutes. Nothing. I wanted to leave, but the guy who rented me the cabin had taken the only set of keys to the old truck that came with the place. He said it was an anti-theft thing. If I needed to leave early, I'd have to call him. I couldn't even start the truck without the key fob he had. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to make it obvious I was awake. I kept the inside dark, lay in bed with my boots on, holding the hatchet. No knocks this time, but I heard movement. Something brushing against the front door. Something heavy. Then the sound of metal scraping would again. But this time, it was coming from the roof. Something or someone had climbed on top of the cabin. I stayed completely still. I could hear the creak of the old boards above me, the shifting of weight, then a dull thud, and then nothing. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun rose, I walked around the cabin with my camera. I took photos of everything, the scrape marks, the boot print I found near the back wall, the edge of the roof. On one of the boards, I saw a line of small scratches, like a knife tip had traced it. I packed my stuff. I put everything in a pile by the door and waited. No one came. At noon, I took one of the old trail maps and started walking toward the main road. I had a compass. I figured if I walked fast, I could make it to the road by dark and flag someone down. I didn't want to be in the woods another night. I didn't make it to the road. About 4 miles in, I realized I was being followed. I don't know how long it had been happening. I wasn't making much noise, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. But at some point, I noticed the rhythm of twigs breaking behind me. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't step like that. It was slower, deliberate. I kept walking. I didn't run. I didn't want to show panic. But my hands were shaking. I had the hatchet in one, compass in the other. I kept looking back. At one point, I saw movement between the trees. Just a flash of someone ducking behind a trunk. Human height, pale jacket. That was all I saw. I changed direction, left the trail completely and moved fast through the brush. I tried to make a wide circle back to the cabin. I figured I'd take the truck, keys or not. I'd hotwire it or break a window or something. But when I got back near the cabin, I stopped. The front door was open. I hadn't left it that way. I crouched in the woods for a long time watching. There was no sound, no movement, but something was wrong. I felt it. Eventually, I moved slowly toward the back. I didn't go inside. I climbed into the bed of the truck, broke the back window with the hatchet and climbed in. Found the glove box. No key, of course, but there was a flare gun under the seat. I took it. I waited until nightfall. I sat in the truck with the flare gun in one hand and the hatchet in the other. I didn't go back inside the cabin. I didn't move. Around midnight, I saw movement again. Someone stepped out of the woods. They didn't come close, just stood there near the pile of firewood, watching. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of them. They didn't move for what felt like an hour. Then they walked around to the back of the cabin. I waited, listened. I could hear them on the porch. Then the scraping again, metal on wood, that same sound. I stepped out of the truck and fired the flare gun straight up. The light was blinding in the darkness. It lit up the trees, the side of the cabin, everything. No one was there. I ran. I didn't stop. I ran through the woods in the direction of the road, flare gun in one hand, compass bouncing on my chest. I didn't stop until I hit gravel. Around 3 a.m., a passing truck saw me and picked me up. The man who rented me the cabin said I must have scared off a bear, that the scratches were probably from raccoons, that I'd imagined the rest. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. A week later, police went out to check the property. They found the boot I saw, and they found something else. It was the fall of 2016 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 33 at the time, working as a freelance web designer. Life had become a blur of screens, emails, and late nights. My eyes were dry constantly, my back hurt, and my sleep was always broken. I lived alone in a small apartment in San Diego, and I'd started to feel boxed in. I wasn't unhappy exactly, but I felt off, like I'd been drifting for a while and couldn't remember what direction I'd been going in. I needed to get away from the internet, the news, everything. A friend had mentioned once that her uncle owned a cabin up near the Idaho-Montana border, tucked into the Bitterroot Mountains, and that it was barely used anymore. I remembered it randomly and reached out. Her uncle didn't mind me borrowing it for a week. I only had to pick up the key from a lockbox behind a gas station about 2 hours from the cabin. She texted me the code and directions, and that was that. I packed light. A few changes of clothes, my old hiking boots, a thick coat, a flashlight, a hatchet, a knife I'd bought years ago but never used, some freeze-dried food, water jugs, a small gas stove, and a few books. I left my laptop behind on purpose. I told one friend where I'd be and when I planned to return. That was the only smart thing I did. The drive up was long, about 18 hours straight. I broke it into 2 days, sleeping at a motel in Missoula the first night. The second day, I picked up the key as planned and followed the winding roads through the trees. The directions were clear. Past the 3rd-mile marker on a dirt road, take a left where the big stump sits, go straight through a gate with a broken lock, and after 2 more miles the cabin will be on your left, partly hidden behind tall pines. It was exactly where she said it'd be. The cabin looked old but solid. Made of weather-worn logs, it had a small front porch, a metal roof, and a stone chimney. A generator was parked off to the side, half covered by a tarp. I didn't bother with it. I'd brought enough batteries and didn't want to listen to engine noise all day. There was a woodpile next to the door, dry and neatly stacked. A large axe leaned against it, blade slightly rusted. I took a picture with my phone, mostly out of habit, then turned it off. That was the last time I used it. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust, wood, and old ash. There was a single room with a stone fireplace, a small table and 2 chairs, a counter with a sink that probably connected to a nearby spring, and a narrow cot with a lumpy mattress. A lantern hung from a nail on the wall. There were 2 windows, one looking out into the woods behind the cabin, the other facing the small clearing in front. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked a little, read, cooked on the small stove, and split wood for fun. At night, I built small fires in the hearth and sat close, writing in a small notebook I'd brought along. The silence was total. There were no planes overhead, no passing cars. Just wind through the trees, sometimes the call of a distant bird. At first, I found it beautiful. By the 3rd day, I started noticing small things. I found a boot print just past the woodline behind the cabin, near a mossy rock where I sometimes sat to drink coffee in the morning. I wear a size 10, and this print was easily a 12 or larger. It looked fresh, not flattened by rain or wind. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I told myself it could have been an old print that hadn't eroded yet, or even an animal that stepped just right. I brushed it off. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up. I wasn't sure why. The fire had died down to glowing coals. I lay still, listening. I didn't hear anything at first. Then I noticed it, the faint crunch of footsteps outside. Not the quick, casual kind. These were slow, careful. I thought maybe it was a deer, but they stopped directly outside the window behind the cot. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After about a minute, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I kept the fire low and waited for dawn. When the light finally came, I got up and went outside. I looked around the cabin slowly. The ground was covered in pine needles and soft dirt. I found faint tracks, long, narrow impressions that led into the woods. I followed them for maybe 30 yards before they vanished into undergrowth. I told myself again it could have been a hiker. Maybe someone else used the cabin sometimes. I tried to let it go, but I started keeping the hatchet close and carried the knife on my belt from then on. On the 5th day, things escalated. That afternoon, I hiked to a ridge about a mile north of the cabin. There was an overlook there with a clear view of the valley below, and I wanted to sketch it. I stayed out a little too long. The sun dipped behind the mountains faster than I expected, and by the time I started back, it was already dim under the trees. About halfway to the cabin, I started hearing branches snapping behind me. Not constantly, just every so often. I'd stop, listen, and hear nothing. Then I'd walk again and snap. I didn't run. I didn't want to look panicked. I kept walking at a steady pace, gripping the hatchet in my hand. When I reached the cabin clearing, I turned and looked back. Nothing. I listened for several minutes. The woods were silent. I went inside, locked the door, and built a fire. I ate quickly and lay down, staring at the ceiling until sleep took me. That night, I woke again. This time, it was the sound of the door handle rattling. It wasn't wind. It was slow, rhythmic, like someone testing the lock. I froze. The fire was almost dead again. I slid off the cot and picked up the hatchet. I stood by the fireplace for what felt like hours. The handle rattled again, then stopped. Then came 3 knocks. Slow, heavy knocks. I didn't say anything. I didn't make a sound. I waited. Nothing else happened. The silence returned. I stayed standing the rest of the night, hatchet in hand. When light came, I opened the door slowly. Nothing there. No footprints this time. The ground was dry, hard-packed. If someone had been there, they didn't leave any trace. I debated leaving that day. I only had 2 days left, but I hated the idea of someone or something driving me out. I wanted to stay to prove to myself I wasn't being paranoid. I should have left. That afternoon, I hiked again, but I didn't go far. I just wanted to move to burn off nervous energy. About half a mile from the cabin, I found something strange. A small piece of cloth was hanging from a branch at chest height. It looked like it had been cut, not torn. Faded green like a jacket liner. I didn't touch it. Below it, on the ground, was something worse, what looked like a carved wooden figure. It was shaped like a person but crude. About 6 inches tall, arms outstretched, legs together. No face, just a round head and a roughly shaped body. It had been stabbed into the dirt with a stick. I backed away slowly. I didn't touch any of it. I turned and walked back to the cabin, fast but not running. Once inside, I locked the door and started packing. That night, I kept every light I had on. I put the table against the door, though it probably wouldn't stop anyone determined. I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair by the window watching the trees. At some point past midnight, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Just a flicker. Then I saw it again. Person. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline. They stood still for a long time, then moved along the edge, slowly circling. Not coming closer, just watching. Then I saw another figure, then a third. They stood just far enough away that I couldn't see their features. They didn't speak, didn't move toward the cabin. They just watched. For hours. Eventually, around dawn, they were gone. I left the second the sun was fully up. I didn't pack properly. I grabbed my bag, stuffed it with what I could, and left the rest. I hiked fast to my car. The whole time, I kept glancing behind me. I didn't see anyone. I drove until I hit a gas station with other people, then kept driving until I was back in Missoula. I reported what I saw to the sheriff's department there. They took my statement but didn't seem too concerned. No one else had reported anything strange in the area. The cabin was technically on private property, so unless I had names or could prove something criminal had happened, there wasn't much they could do. I flew home. I didn't tell my friend what happened, just that the trip hadn't gone well. 2 weeks later, I had a security system installed in my apartment. I started sleeping with the lights on. For months, I kept waking up in the middle of the night, convinced someone was outside. I started taking self-defense classes, not because I thought it would help if something really went wrong, but because it made me feel like I was doing something. I still think about the cabin, about the boot prints, the figures, the cloth on the branch, the carved figure in the dirt. I don't know who they were or what they wanted. I never went back. I never will. But sometimes I dream about the sound of someone knocking, and I always wake up before the third knock.